And so I guess from a very early age, I just look at things like race as unimportant to me at least, as far as making distinctions between who's good and evil, who's kind and not, that type of thing. Harley, if you get right down to it, race itself is sort of an artificial construct. You stick, I don't know, 300,000 people on an island somewhere, you come back, whatever it is, 1,000, 3,000, 5,000 years later, you got yourself a new race, I guess.
Right.
So it just seemed like an artificial barrier between people. And then more and more, I was curious as to why there was this artificial barrier. And when it became readily clear to me that it was because it benefited some people to be racists, that attitude wasn't quite prevalent.
The democratization of America has been a journey stippled with moments of triumph, of passion, and of the deepest honor to be part of a greater good. That is not to say that the American vision has materialized into view without the time, determination, or sacrifice of its people. On several occasions, the American populace has cleared its throat and spoke out for the sake of a democratic national union. Perhaps two of the most momentous points in the democratization of America are derived from the civil rights movement of the 1950s through 60s, along with the Vietnam War protests of the 1960s through 70s. This era of the nation's history, in becoming a more modernized and independent society, was made possible by the impressive collaboration and will of the citizenry to unite. Yet the individual was by no means lost amongst the sea of protests and demonstrations sparked by these two events. It was the passion of the individual that made the democratization of America possible, and the stories enduring from each pair of eyes, from each voice, and from each American reflect the spirit of this era of reform. Mark Epstein, born in the midst of these two protest movements in the year 1955, is one such individual whose spirit of progressive thought has lasted through the ages, much like the legacy of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protests he was witness to. Growing up on Long Island near Levittown, after moving from Brooklyn, New York, Mr. Epstein was subjected to the racism fostered in post-World War II suburbia. As a Jewish man, he recalls such, quote, artificial barriers as the community's limit on the number of Jews allowed in the area, along with the grueling pressure of conformity promoted in his school. Needless to say, the community in which Mr. Epstein spent much of his youth was one avidly partaking in the practice of segregation. Despite this unpromising beginning, Mark was inspired to regard race as unimportant. The purpose of the civil rights movement was not dissimilar to the views held by Mr. Epstein in his philosophy on liberal American society. Beginning as a grassroots movement and growing to gain national attention, the civil rights movement sought to achieve equal protection of the laws based on the basic rights of Americans set forth in the Constitution. While the height of this movement is generally believed to be during the 1950s and 60s, many argue that reform truly began during the Reconstruction era that took place after the Civil War, when Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution around the years 1865 to 1870. Since then, the civil rights movement, originally directed towards obtaining rights for African Americans, has extended to equal protection for women, gays and lesbians, ethnic minorities, and religious denominations. Mr. Epstein attributes his liberal views on such details as race to the discussions, which tended to be heated, between his father and his maternal grandfather. His father, a self-made liberal, sought to question the admittedly racist views of his father-in-law. In addition to these discussions, Mr. Epstein seemed to resonate with the liberal comments made by his two uncles, and in this way he learned a great deal about the meaning of civil rights from the revisionist atmosphere he was brought up in. While his father was very much in favor of the civil rights movement, Mr. Epstein's mother, though he loved her dearly, was a bystander to the racist ideology of her generation. Mr. Epstein recalled a specific moment in his memory that draws to a point the dynamic and opposing views of his family and his society. When his older sister, Fern, brought a man that she was dating of mixed race home to meet her family, their mother, quote, went ballistic and refused to let Fern's boyfriend into the house. Overwhelming emotions that Mr. Epstein recalls feeling were humiliation and embarrassment on the behalf of all. Fern's boyfriend happened to be the godson of civil rights activist and chief organizer of the March on Washington, Bayard Rustin. Rustin was the mastermind behind national and international demonstrations on the behalf of humanity. Bayard Rustin, a colored homosexual, advocated the American pacifist movement and was a strong supporter of nonviolence. Although he spent 28 months in jail at one point, and was jailed periodically thereafter, Rustin never abandoned his beliefs and dreamed of world peace and brotherhood. He supported India's independence movement from Great Britain, as well as similar movements in African countries. He planned and organized freedom rides throughout the South, as well as such famous demonstrations as the Montgomery Bus Company boycott and the 1963 March on Washington, during which Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. Bayard Rustin, a man who had achieved such greatness in his role as a civil rights icon, had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Mark Epstein as a young boy. After the meeting, Mr. Epstein recalled reading a book on Martin Luther King Jr. and being forever enlightened about the subject of social segregation. Mr. Epstein's first-hand account of the happenings of the civil rights movement allowed him to, quote, attack the myths of society and create an articulate argument for the ideals he wished to contribute to the democratization of America. Mr. Epstein's role in the liberalization of America did not end with his account of the civil rights movement. During the presidency of Nixon, America's most unpopular war in Vietnam was coming into full scrutiny at a domestic level. The opposition towards the Vietnam War in part came from the gruesome coverage of the news media circuit and from the growing distrust in government that followed the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. The nation erupted into uproar over the events surrounding the Vietnam War and caused a wave of protests that aimed to democratize the momentarily undemocratic country. Despite ideological opposition to the war in Vietnam, again influenced by the views of his father, Mark Epstein enlisted in the Coast Guard the year America pulled out of Vietnam. Mr. Epstein explained that his enlistment in the Coast Guard was a combination of his parents' planning, his coming of age for the draft, and his desire to make something of his post-high school career. Although his uncle, Alan, paid a psychiatrist to document that he was clinically insane, as the Epsteins are, quote, lovers, not fighters, Mr. Epstein endured a harsh time at boot camp with Commander Chambers, who didn't like, quote, Yankees or Jews. Prior to his enlistment in the Coast Guard, Mr. Epstein recalled a specific event that sparked his interest in the Vietnam War. He accompanied his grandfather to a doctor's appointment, during which he listened to a candid conversation about the recent death of the doctor's nephew in Vietnam. During the car ride home, Mr. Epstein asked his grandfather about Vietnam, the whereabouts, the reason why so many people were dying there, but never got the extent of the information he desired. Later on, he read up on the war and asked questions about it. The influence of two high school teachers added to these questions. One, a conservative, and the other a reactionary, Mr. Epstein respected their opinions but politely disagreed. Although he was raised to fear communism, the containment theory, the domino effect, and the purpose of the war in Vietnam, they never resonated with Mr. Epstein. It was the opposition to these opinions and the exploration of his own ideology that led in part to Mr. Epstein's path in becoming a teacher of the social sciences. The Vietnam War and surrounding events proved to Mr. Epstein that government had the capacity to be a positive institution in shaping society, but had the tendency to become corrupted. This said, Mr. Epstein began to see the advantages of having a transparent government that is able to be reformed and democratized by its people. Part of what Mr. Epstein took away as a witness to the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protests was the right of the American people to convince the government of what is right and what is wrong. Mr. Epstein is a long-standing revisionist supporting the notion that change comes about from conflict, a concept perhaps epitomized in the events surrounding the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. The living legacy of the democratization of America is very much present in the spirit of the story shared by Mr. Epstein, and this passion of the individual is truly at the heart of what makes America exceptional.